Okie dokie. Uh, it's taping, so one way or another, this is going to get recorded. Welcome to the July 1st, this and that problematic day in the United States. Supreme Court granted a kind of partial immunity for President of the United States in terms of official acts, which of course raises the hypothetical that came up during the appeals court by the appeals court that is that SEAL Team 6 could be ordered by a president to eliminate political opponents. That would be an official act. So that's one element that makes for a difficult day, but more amusing conversations later. Tonight in TAC, writing and sports, interesting things. But this and that today is going to revisit what we sort of didn't do yesterday and sort of didn't do earlier, and that is revisit Andy Higgenbottom's lectures of on Capital, Volume 2. Actually, we're going to do the bridge lecture from Volume 1, which is at the end of the lecture series for Volume 1, and is a kind of introduction to Volume 2. So we're going to sort of start a little earlier. And perhaps if we have time, we'll do lecture 1 of Volume 2, the Volume 2 series. But before that, and we're not going to get that far, probably. I'm going to yak for a bit. And in fact, we may never get to those particular tapes for a variety of reasons. Anyway, what I did last night was, and you'll see it below in the text, that I'm finally starting to do some original thinking. Perhaps I asked Gemini to relate 3 concepts for me. And it is kind of what I use Gemini for, is a kind of check on whether I'm sort of thinking generally in the right direction. Not that it's going to guide my writing or my thoughts, but it is a kind of check on my thinking, on my logic. So I use the 3 terms: sublation, valorization, and indexicality, which are the above 2. Sublation and valorization are terms that Marx uses. I applied indexicality, which is largely a linguistic concept, in some versions of semiotics. Partially because these are all tied together. I would assert to you that Marxism is, among many things, it's a human science, and that it's necessary to sort of relate all these things together. What it came up with is that they're all about transformation, which is useful as a core or family resemblance, a core concept, in that in sublation, as in the German, it preserves gates. It leads to a new form. It's about context dependence, and an example could be a revolution sublates the old social order, creating a new system. Kind of the point of things like the manifesto at all. Valorization assigns value, which can change. It is context dependent, and the example that Gemini came up with, painting might be more valuable to an art collector than to someone who doesn't appreciate art. So in other words, this is the valorization is the application of adding value in one sense, but it also could be about the task in a more limited sense of self-valorization. Indexicality refers to, it depends on context. It's about meaning. That is, if you're going to be delivering messages, they should probably have a meaning, and that meaning probably depends on context. And it is essentially very important for meaning to have a context for understanding it. Isolated words often become really problematic, um, just as an example. And the example the Gemini chose was here and now have different meanings depending on who is speaking and when. So, therefore, it is about identity and about time, uh, also space, if you indulge that kind of knowledge. And temporal single system interpretations, that is TSSI, we'll get to that in a moment. The research question I'm sort of asking, it's not the full research question, it's simply a critical question, is TSSI a totalizing discourse, which is a post-structuralist kind of question that some people have. So that's kind of what goes on there. So the example I'm going to choose is from baseball. So, and you'll see hopefully where that goes. Moneyball is a idea about using analytic processes to evaluate personnel, baseball personnel, and specifically, and the use of analytic categories like statistics, more specifically sabermetrics, which identifies certain types of uh, statistics and it uses them to organize and minimize costs for a roster or payroll, a wage bill, as it were, for a baseball team. The Oakland A's, a team that goes back to Charlie Finley and Bill Veeck. I don't know, but anyway, Charlie Finley, who was much like Bill Veeck. And the Oakland A's are being moved to Las Vegas. There's a lot of bureaucracy, of course, involved in trying to move teams. And a lot of money, of course, is involved. And it actually has the same kind of elements that you might imagine. A baseball team is a small organization, firm, sits in a kind and dependent very much on the region in which it sits. But it also is, of course, a component of a league, a cartel, as it were, of teams. And of course, public money often becomes involved in having such teams because the audience that they serve is a public, of course, and also and then there's local governments and all kinds of other things. So it's interesting to see that kind of entity operative. Anyway, A's are moving from Oakland to Las Vegas, Nevada, and some questions have arisen, and I'm going to repeat a Wall Street Journal article here, but the point I want to make hopefully will be somewhat clear. That is, you have a thing, it's an activity, it makes money, it's a service in some ways, but it's also uh, a type of commodity, problematic in very many ways. Involves, sort of day-to-day players who are relatively okay, who've sort of had a vetting process, minor leagues, etc. Uh, Also has stars usually. And Moneyball is a book that became a movie with Brad Pitt about Billy Beane, who used to be a former player and who is a advisor to the A's. I guess he will remain an advisor to the A's despite the move. But Billy Beane sort of invented a way or decided to choose a way of organizing his roster, managing the personnel, as it were, of a team. He was not the general manager or the on-field manager. Let's put it that way. And the movie actually has much of the conflict that arose from all of these. This a decision making made on kind of analytic procedures that are not rigorous. Of course, it's an art rather than a science once you start managing people, but it's sort of interesting. So the question: before the Oakland A's moved to Las Vegas, they're working To negotiate the number of home games they'll be allowed to play anywhere but Las Vegas. Baseball teams, actually other teams, uh, football teams now in American football teams play a game or two in other countries like England. Um, Similarly, basketball teams often do not play in their original cities, but rather in cities around their region. I think the Celtics have played in Springfield. The Warriors have well, they've played in a variety of places. Um, I think they even played in Sacramento before Sacramento had a team. But anyway, those kinds of things happen, and it is a way of building audience, etc. But this is quite a distance. That is Oakland to Las Vegas, and there is the proposal because it's going to take probably 3 years, 3 seasons anyway, for Oakland to move to Las Vegas. That um, even though the lease is up at the Oakland Stadium, and there was a failure to build a new stadium, which is another story. The the A's want to play in a variety of other places, either Sacramento or in the minor league. There's I think, a AAA team in Las Vegas already, and has a stadium. I don't think it's an A's franchise, so it's not an A's minor league team, as I recall. And so, but they do want to play in that stadium as well. So this is the article from the Wall Street Journal. But if and when it does happen, A's president Dave Kaval said in an interview, the team believes that the increased revenue from a new stadium will allow the team to abandon the Moneyball approach. Devised by general manager Billy Beane, who's now a senior advisor to the club, and made legend by a Michael Lewis book, the Moneyball strategy involves using data to identify high-value players who are undervalued by the market. The reality is the entire Moneyball system that Billy Beane devised was based on the fact that we had limited resources, Kaval said. Now, with moving to Las Vegas and having higher revenues that we can invest on the players' side, we can still use some of those techniques of valuing undervalued assets, but we'll have money to play in the free agent marketplace. It's just going to be a completely new day in terms of the on-field product. Well, that's, bullpucky. The A's on-field aesthetic has often been defined by the bright green and gold of their uniforms, but it is the green and gold of operating a profitable ball club that has evaded the organization. The facilities in Oakland have deteriorated, and now so has the baseball product. The A's are 33-87 entering Wednesday's play on track for one of the worst seasons in MLB history, Major League Baseball history. The A's have been working toward a ballpark solution to meet a deadline in the most recent MLB-MLBPA, the Players Association collective bargaining agreement, that says the A's won't receive revenue sharing money from the league if they haven't entered into a binding agreement to construct a new Major League Baseball facility by January 15, 2024. The league's definition of a binding agreement is unclear, but a league source said the A's have met the threshold and are eligible to continue receiving revenue sharing after 2023. Their lease to play in Oakland expires after the 2024 season. The timeline for a new ballpark in Las Vegas has a projected opening in 2028, which would leave the team without a home venue for at least 3 seasons. But there's a difference between an outlook in Oakland and an outlook in Las Vegas. In Oakland, at least, the organization has had 50 years to build fan support, and in Nevada, they'll be starting fresh. The model, of course, is the movement of the Oakland Raiders American Football League team to Las Vegas recently. They're not playing in the same stadium, although that was what happened to the A's and Raiders before in Oakland. The A's hope that by relocating to Las Vegas, they can create a new reality for a new locale of A's fans. When we're in Las Vegas, we can have a much higher payroll and still be a break-even team, that is, in terms of wins. I suppose, in terms of wins. No, well, actually, in terms of profit, we think we can be even more competitive with our ability to put good talent on the field and to be successful. So that's kind of from the top. There are other issues, and we can chat about that perhaps afterwards or even later tonight during game time. The basic description is of the book is Moneyball: The Art of Winning an Unfair Game by Michael Lewis, published in 2003 about the Oakland Athletics baseball team and its general manager, Billy Beane. It describes the team's sabermetric approach. Bill James, I suppose, gave us sabermetrics, who he does the stats at the Boston Red Sox. Uh, the One of the people who was subsequently at the A's after um, once Billy Beane started getting Moneyball working was Farhan Saidi, who also an economist who did the same analytics, went to the Dodgers and built a pretty good on field product, although never quite getting to the World Series. Well, getting to the World Series, but not quite winning the World Series, I suppose. And he was bought by the Giants. So the Giants have I suppose, one could assume, a analytic approach. And they also changed managers so that Bruce Bochy, the guy who gave, as it were, who led the Giants to three uh, biennial, as it were, I think 2010, 2012, 2014 pennant World Series rings, whatever, championships, is no longer there. And of course, the proof of how good Bruce Bochy is that they dragged him out of retirement a couple of years ago, brought him back to Texas and provided a winning season in Texas, Texas Rangers, I guess. So anyway, competitive team on a small budget led to the 2011 film Moneyball, starring Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. The pre weight loss Jonah Hill. So anyway, those are that's the kind of background against I want to talk today. We're at the end. I might do the tape that does the bridge tape between uh, the first series, the lectures for Marxist Capital, Volume 1 by Andy Higgenbottom, and then the um, lecture 1 in the Volume 2 series, which is still going on, and we're up to lecture number 5, even though Higginbottom says it's lecture number 6. I assume you'll correct that at some moment. The sixth, the technically the sixth lecture will come up in a couple of weeks, I suppose, because they run for an entire year. Um, whereas we're trying to drive through volume 2 and perhaps get to volume 3 to end in the fall sometime with a complete reading of Capital. But betwixt then, I think what we're going to try and do is fill in, or what my intent is to try and fill in people's reading so that at any moment you can sort of review the backgrounds that are necessary. And it is Marx's goal, actually, to see it as a whole, that is, and Higginbottom presents it in the same way, that there's something that ties all three volumes together, and that you do need to do a fair amount of background reading. There's math if you really want to go there, but you don't have to. And that's I would hope, the beauty, and which is why I did that little Gemini transformation above, that suggests that there's things that can tie together certain ideas here that show that it is a logically consistent text, even though what one's view of logic is a different question, as I'll probably show by the end of my yakking today. Yeah, I hope so. Anyway, there are different emphases of Marxist schools in looking at Capital, more specifically Capital Volume 1, but Higginbottom identifies various approaches here, and you can see a multiplicity of various schools of thought from Marx's point of view. That is a value form school, uh, a system dialectics method, that there is abstraction and exchange, form determinations. The question Higgenbottom asks is, well, how is it that we do these determinations? And it raises a volume of other kinds of analytic questions. That's one version. The traditional Marxist version, the exploitation, production, essential class content, tendency to neo-Ricardian socialism. And yes, that's a very major line of thought that in the 20th century that is still worth following. And I think, as you'll see, you sort of need that background to work through some of the technical issues. And then there are specialist treatments, mostly wrong direction because input outputs, whereas essence appearance, there's the question of contradictions. Are there contradictory elements, or if you build on a dialectical model, you're going to have contradictions. So to assert that there are no contradictions, well, that's another question. And then, of course, the contradictions are real, part of the whole, fulfilling design, which I just suggested. Value form of surplus labor and its actualization extend beyond profit. So there are lots of little words here, right? Essentially, it is how we build value, how certain value gets skimmed off or exploited, taken away, extracted. And what Marx does is identify the essential contradictory internal relations and its mediations. That is, you don't have simple relations between things, but that there is a variety of mediation that goes on, the kind of mediation that happens in language. And then there's further development of the quantity form as a bearer of value, surplus value, and profit. It's really as simple as that. It seems more complicated. It's fairly simple. You have classes of people. Some people in their exchanges take advantage of other people, and some people believe in a more equanimity. They believe in equanimity, that is a certain means by which we can be fairer to one another. But that may not exist. We can believe that, certainly, but in reality, that doesn't necessarily happen. And history has shown us that you can have those beliefs, certainly, could build entire religions around them. But the reality tends to be a little slightly different, as history has shown us. And so there's the lecture 15 from the volume 1 series and the lecture 1 from the volume 2 series. So he does a lot of integration in these two lectures. So if you've read volume 1, regardless of whether you read it or not, there's a way in which we can begin or continue to review volume number 2 of Karl Marx's Capital and the subsequent, now up to 5 lectures in Higgenbottom's series with a certain degree of support. It's fairly clear that Higgenbottom, maybe because he just simply gets bored, goes through his own little videos quite quickly. And despite the fact that I've been playing them at 1.25 speed, they require several repeated viewing simply because he's just cramming a lot of information in all of these. And of course, the advantage, asynchronously speaking, is that you have all of those lectures there to work with. And if you need to go back to the volume 1 lectures, you should, because or you should, because even as he summarizes in in the volume 1 lecture 15 and the lecture 1 of volume 2, they are not perfect. Need to sort of get the idea of where he's coming from. And it's not all Higgenbottom's original ideas. He's borrowing from many other people as well. There's a certain trend in trying to deal with capital. It is different in various literatures. It's different in China. It's different in Russia. It's different in Latin America. So And in fact, the global South's approach to Marx often doesn't require looking at certain brands of Marxism, although it also fails because it occasionally sticks to certain ideas that really haven't kept up with, I think, the way human history has moved. And now that we're in a kind of environmental crisis, that's kind of where we are. All right. So contradiction is clearly part of this, part of the process. So if you think that contradiction represents a kind of logical issue that invalidates something, that's not necessarily so. If you, in fact, if you built a system of logic on a certain contradictory elements, there it is possible to do it that way. Now you could take it really far and wind up with a kind of nihilism, which is what sort of happens in other people's thought at the end of the 19th century. But you'll also see that even that nihilism does have even import from Marxists. Anyway, contradiction is antagonistic, not resolved within thought, except ideally as anticipation. That's kind of what goes on in the if you will, the kind of utopian promise or hope of accepting a dialectical materialist set of beliefs that we anticipate that, one would anticipate that we would, as it were, transcend capitalism and achieve socialism and ultimately a communist classless society. Now, and we can create all kinds of wonderful stories and narratives about how wonderful that would be. Fact is, we're still stuck with being here and being quite material. Whatever. We can have ideological preferences for that there is some world beyond this one, but those are other issues. So there are fundamental subjects like exploiter and exploited. This is all about the relational elements, and it is this movement from being to essence to as it were, in the Hegelian sense, that there's concepts at work and that return back as in a kind of systematic way with contradictions. So, and of course, you can see sublation mentioned here. And so there is a general, a general movement, a particular movement, and a singularity that works. So the entire logical system connects all three volumes, and you can actually read them that way. That's what Higgenbottom does. He says, well, there's something that connects all these things in a kind of singularity. And in fact, the analogy to singularity in the physical sciences or cosmology is a kind of interesting idea. More specifically about Hegelian context is that you can see that there's certain general outlines. There's the attempt to create universals, but there's a historical limitation, and it's not universal. Even as in Hegel, Hegel was always trying to achieve the universal, but never fully achieving it. So we always look at these things as kind of context-driven or contingent. The particularities of the concept, that is, trying to find the deepness, the historical elements, all of the things that are part of developing an idea are kind of there. So those are the key elements. Now, one of the key positions in sort of rethinking the kind of dominant ways in which we think of Marxism, there's a modes of production approach, which is based on a kind of historical materialism that suggests history has moved in a variety of ways from certain more ancient or often referred to pejoratively, I suppose, as primitive to feudal modes of production, then to and there's in between elements as well, to a capitalist mode of production, and then ultimately to a communist mode of production, which has never been fully achieved. Although the primitive mode of production is one that there's a kind of primitive communism that does operate in there that is often quite interesting. It's the idea of, do we really need money? Can we be moneyless in that particular context, which is very interesting. And we imagine that projected in perhaps into the future where necessity is always met, is always fulfilled, let's put that way. Now, one way to try and preempt that in some ways is to assume that that in the technical argument in the mode of product or the productionist argument is that exchange is actually much more important. And that reveals the issue of motion or the fact of exchange as being important to build value. And so a fellow by the name of Karatani, who wrote a book on the structure of world history, and we probably should read that in its English translation at some moment. This is Karatani speaking. Orthodox Marxist theory, using an architectural metaphor that he wants to provide a simple explanation, explains the history of social forms in terms of modes of production, which form the economic base or foundation, and of the political or ideational superstructures that are determined by that base. So there's a basic base and superstructure model. Often, Marx never talks about it as base and superstructures, just so you know. A mode of production consists of the productive forces which arise from the relations between humans and nature, and the relations of production, which are constituted by the relations among humans. I do not oppose the idea that the history of social forms is determined by the economic base, but in my view, that base consists not of modes of production, but rather modes of exchange. What I call modes of exchange includes both relations between nature and humans and relations between humans or among humans. I came to see things this way as a result of various critiques that were mounted in response to problems in the Marxist view that modes of production constituted the economic base, critiques that ultimately resulted in a rejection of the idea of an economic base. So there was a proposition that has existed for many years, that is, human activity is economic in the final instance, that lots of other things can occur, but ultimately it is about these material or economic relations that are important or determining, which is a whole other set of problems. Lest you think that's unimportant, entire regional or country ideologies have been built on those ideas, and they are the kind of dominant model building exercise. And it can be made problematic in the sense that we can offer it up as a kind of problem for analysis. Now, one way of doing this, and one version of this by one particular line of thought, in this case, Ben Klein and Alfredo Saad-Filho, is the idea of the circuits of capital. And rather than talk about sphere production, cycle of production or mode of production versus mode of exchange, but rather it's an entire cycle or a circuit. So the circuit of industrial capital, which is kind of the original way in which base and superstructure were thought of in a very modern sense. In other words, a modern society is built on its ability to industrialize, and industrialization in the 19th and 20th centuries represents a really important move in modernizing and perhaps civilizing a country. They're very problematic words in development and very uneven, as we know now. There are some, places in the world where, on the one hand, there's no landlines for talking to people on the phone, and people kind of do stuff, and things aren't quite as pristine as one would like. On the other hand, everybody's got a cell phone, so that's a whole nother different question. The same people. The circuit of industrial capital is best represented by a circular flow diagram. That this circuit is important for laying out the basic structure of the capitalist economy and how the spheres of production and exchange are integrated with one another through the movement of capital as surplus value is produced. There's a lot here. That is, as surplus value is produced, distributed, and exchanged. As the circuit repeats itself, remember we were talking about repetition before, surplus value is thrown off. That is, you can see this little thing flying off S above. This shows that capital as self-expanding value embraces not only definite social relations of production, but is also a circular movement going through its various stages. So in other words, there's a movement of a circular movement of surplus value going on. If S is accumulated for use as capital, we can think of expanded reproduction as being represented by an outward spiral movement. Now, it is this sort of spiraling out and spiraling in that sort of goes on, a kind of double helix, as it were, of this entire set of actions, which, is a kind of interesting metaphor. So, if we're looking at, you know, the circuit of money capital, we can describe it in a variety of ways, and that is in the basic MCM CMC model, we can say, the cyclical movement of capital is that. It's the same with this circle here. Here is C, which is means of production and labor power, moves to P in the sphere of production, moves to C prime because things get added, enhanced, as it were, and then to M. And then you have this kind of repetition of these kinds of CMC, MCM, blah, blah, blah. And then while you're doing that, surplus spins off. Now, the reality, of course, is that it's more complicated than that, and many things are moving simultaneously, but they do move in cycles. And so there are several cycles: a cycle of money capital, a cycle of productive capital, and a cycle of commodity capital. So if we're describing volume two, these are, while you can look at them separately, they're not separate. They're kind of overlap. And so there is this idea. This is from Ed George's notes on the reading of capital, and particularly volume two. And I put a link in there. Ed George did the really tedious, I suppose, activity of looking at all three volumes of capital and trying to make sense of it. And he does it in a fairly reasonable way. I think there are issues, perhaps, but at least he does all of them. And it took him several years to do it, but it's on the internet. It is worth looking at. I repeat some of them here because he's taken some of the sort of tedious elements and made them at least a little briefer, and also cleared up some of the not so much mistakes. Perhaps some of them are typographical errors that Marx made in his manuscript. So some of that gets cleared up, and it's also repositioned to the 21st century, which is what we need to do anyway to make some sense of it. So the material content of MC, this is the first phase. You go from M to C. It's not the form of MC, that is the transformation of money into commodities, which indicates that it forms part of the cycle of capital, but it's material content, the specific use character of the commodities that take place with money. The movement that we're considering here is the purchase of means of production. You're buying equipment and raw materials, and then you're also hiring people to do stuff. The material and personal factors of commodity production. The movement MC we're considering here is thus the thing we were just looking here. MC. MC, then ultimately M again, and then C, and it just keeps going. The qualitative distinction between L and MP, that is between labor power and means of production. But this notwithstanding, at the same time, MC, that is MC divided into L, labor power and means of production, also expresses a necessary quantitative relation between labor and means of production. For the means of production purchase must be just sufficient in quantity to consume it in its entirety, the labor power bought. Now, if the means of production turns out to be insufficient to do this, you don't have enough raw materials, the machines are not so good, then a part of the surplus labor at the disposal of the buyer is not made use of. But if more means of production than can be made use of is bought, then some of it will remain unconverted into products. So there's this kind of idleness that is set aside, similar to the idleness laid fallow in feudal production and in sort of cycling through growing seasons. The transformation of money capital into productive capital. The whole deal here is producing a product with greater value than that of its factors of production. You've heard me do this before. There's a quantitative relationship between labor power and means of production. And, it doesn't always get used up, as we just mentioned. And then money it mediates some of these relationships. So in the big equation, without, being too tedious about it, we have money being created, used to do means of production, that is material, rent, taxes, etc. This is from that earlier article we were looking at. And we can also have machinery, which is also a means of production. We also have the means of production with a certain type of labor applied. That is, if you've read the fucking manual, uh, you need intellectual activity and combined with manual activity, not manual as in a hand. That is the human participation of physical labor, as opposed to reading the actual manual and all of its pages. Because often people don't do that. They think, they're, you grow up and it's a bad habit. You think you can put everything together without looking at the manual because it's a Miller's analogy test. You should be able to figure it out without reading anything. Well, that can be a bad procedure for in many cases, and it's probably much better to actually read the manual for anything. Anyway, MP plus LP, labor power plus means of production, and then create commodities. And those commodities generate after, the entering in a market or whatever, exchange occurs and more exchange value is produced and blah, 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 blah. You get more money, you get profit. That is delta M plus M. So M prime equals M plus delta M. So that's what kind of that all is about. Note that Ed George mentions 3 cycles of capital, circuits of capital. This little fellow I have decided is a really important guy, identifies a 4th circuit of advanced capital. And all of these are, as I've referred to before, kind of nested sets, so that you can see that you have a single activity, a linear activity even, but that each has these kind of embeddedness in it. And lest you think I'm making all this crap up, in volume 2, Marx talks about multiple circuits by different agents in the process. And so, and this is by way of trying to define the different departments. And so you have MCM, CMC circuits. The embeddedness can be revealed this way, and you can go from C prime to C double prime to C double prime to C triple prime, etc. The circuit of capital begins like this, looks like the circle we saw before, but Marx refers to them in a very basic drawing done in a more that's close to what we think perhaps Marx was thinking about, how the cycles work, where the workers fit in, and where the capitalists are in this process. You can see that there's a division here, and that there may be interchange among capitalists, and of course capitalists ordering workers around, and they're not all the same, right? You could have different capitalists, one set of capitalists making the machines for your production line, and they've got workers too. It's somewhere else in Timbuktu or someplace. And so there's space and time is engaged in this set of divisions. As I said, the circulation stage looks kind of similar to what was going on in feudalism, but now you see more intermediaries like money involved.
You're muted, Anley. We have no audio. Press some buttons, Anley. Oh dear. Bing boom. Well, there's that bucket. Internet must have gone out.
Dear
It's the BBC.
USA, your internet providers just suck.
Yes.
Sincerely. And signature at the end.
It's the BBC. We apologize for any inconvenience and we hope to get the program back on track as soon as we can.
I just kind of hope that Anne realized that her connection
Yes.
cut out.
But she's not talking to herself.
Yeah, wouldn't be the first time.
Nope.
Did we lose Anne?
Yes.
Oh no, I've been trying to get
Yeah.
dinner ready. People are coming over, so I wasn't able to listen so much. So darn
Her
it.
connection just cut out.
Oh damn. Wouldn't be the first time
We're
she
still
gets.
recording.
Oh gee.
So
Okay.
don't say fuck or bugger. Oh, sorry. Oh.
On the fun side, we are still on YouTube.
I hope she made co-hosts, or maybe Joe did. I don't know. Yeah, Joe is on, so.
That purge has begun.
That's a good idea, Anna. Joe, are you there?
Oh.
I wonder,
You're watching TAC.
yeah. Okay.
The fun part is only one person is watching, and that's me.
Sometimes just me.
Wonder.
Oh. I bet she's giving herself a cracking lecture. Hmm. Nope. Another hedgehog. The third one, Coco.
I just signaled Joe. I said, Joe, you might want to kill the recording. We lost Prof. Ann. No one is willing to pick up where she left off.
Well, quite impossible to pick up where she left off.
I know. I do get so much out of it. Oh, thanks, Larry. Let's see.
Hmm.
Okay. Hmm.
Tonight, I'm watching Craft while listening to Anne Lee. Is a luthier making a guitar. Very good.
I have never heard of that person. Alufia Vega?
No, a luthier making a guitar.
Oh,
A guitar maker making a guitar.
oh, cool. Oh, very
Yeah.
cool.
I've watched 3 so far. 1 was tremendous, and I
Mhm.
want that guitar. Yeah. Even though it's acoustic and made of wood, he made it totally contoured around the body, and he used hand tools to do the whole thing. Oh, she's back. Must be her. This has to be Anne Lee.
Yes, it is.
Oh, God
Yay.
damn it.
Woo!
Yeah.
Okay, I'm back. Jesus.
Ah.
Right. It was
Yay.
my fault. It was my fault. I
Yay.
didn't have something plugged in and it ran out of power and I'm just was stupid again.
It
Well, we were
happened.
hoping you,
I
yeah.
where I think I screwed up and so I'll be back here.
I can't hear you.
We were lost.
Let's see if we can get this back rolling again. I
Okay.
remember where I left off.
Oh, yay. Okay.
Ding bat it. Meep meep. Come on. There we go. Meep meep.
I'm a road runner, baby.
Normally, come on. It's going to take a second here, I think. Out. Come on. Oh, yes, my internet connection is unstable. Thank you very much for telling me that. All right, here we are finally again, yet again. Oh, okay. So I was talking about spheres of production. I actually moving from to demonstrate actually a set of embedded nested sets of activity circuits, if you will, and that it resembles the same circuits that are described in volume 2. Marx actually describes them this way of moving from W to X to Y to Z, sort of. And they're not the same, of course. The things change, C prime, C double prime, etc. So the circuit of capital begins in one way, that is M, C, C prime, M prime at all. And it is more like this in volume 2, like this in terms of talking about the relation between money, commodities, and production, even in the land level, at the level of land. You know, the fallow 1, fallow 2 here is about the land that you leave fallow, which is a kind of surplus, and without getting too far afield, but you can see at every circulation stage, you have some things that bridge the transformation. So similarly, there's a sphere of circulation, which in this case is a hemisphere, and a sphere of production, which is a hemisphere. um, so it does eventually wind up with a CMC or a CMC prime, and then et cetera, moving down the road. And you can see that any sphere of production and any sphere of consumption has several different elements in it: overproduction, technological dynamism, appropriation in the sphere of production, which moves over into the sphere of production. You have things that are somewhat external to that, exogenous to that: alienation, financialization, and acceleration among them, things that are outside, but obviously could be conceived as part of the system moving along. And then you have 4 and 9, commodification and concentration, occurring in the intersection of the two sets. And this is a kind of simple way of thinking about it, that you have the things interpenetrate, and in effect they're interoperative, to use a more modern concept, on which I'll probably write something. I refer you, of course, to the original structure designed by Harry Cleaver that discusses the path of arguments, but you can sort of see where they're going, and they are there. It's hard to kind of structure it, and you kind of, once you start reading it, you go, darn it, what was he really talking about this? But Harry Cleaver, having taught capital for decades, I think got to a way of talking about this that at least can be drawn out in this way in which commodity goes this way to money form. You have the money form here. It goes to this way to become money itself, money as a commodity in a system of money. And then this is the same money. It is over here, and money, because of debtors and creditors, among many other things, becomes capital, which is a kind of value in process, which has surplus values and non-equivalents or exchange equivalents, things that are exchanged equivalently, but then asymmetric exchanges. And within this, still, if you believe it, the buying and selling of labor power, which is also part of this system. And it is within this antagonistic system of capital and labor that you get class struggle. So you started with commodity, which is what Marx is doing, and tries to get here because of this system, these sets of systems that abstract and apply to whole varieties of things in an economy or in a society. And you can see how it could become a kind of class struggle. In fact, you can take it further. You could confuse yourself further, as if you decide to design subclasses, that is, working class divided by races or by gender. Aside from the idea that we think of class as simply an income level, no, it's about a whole bunch of other things that we're aware of. And then when you think about the professional managerial class, it gets even more confusing, as it were, especially when you can have corrupt people in any and all of these classes. So I included the thing that I did before of referring to a four circuit model of capital. And we've looked at that before. And the thing that I began yakking about in the beginning, where I asked Gemini to combine multiple concepts, but look towards their kind of family resemblance to see what is it that they share. And they are all conversations about transformation, sublation being having a built-in kind of negation, particularly in terms of Marx and Hegel. Valorization, the question of value, and indexicality, which I've ported over from semiotics, that talks about the meaning of all these things. And all of these are context dependent, and they have various dimensions to them. And I'll talk about that further. So they have a shared emphasis. This is Gemini speaking. All three concepts involve some degree of transformation. Sublation involves both preserving and negating something, leading to a new form. Think of a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly, carrying over some elements, but fundamentally changing. Valorization, which implies assigning value or worth to something. This value can change over time or through different contexts. So that's just adding value in the simple way. And then indexicality. Words or expressions shift their meaning dependent on the context. And Marx does that himself in terms of talking about value, for example. Depending on the year it got written, Marx refers to value sometimes in very different ways, yet uses the same word. So this is context dependent. All three are influenced by context to some extent. Sublation, the way something is sublated, that is preserved and negated, depends on the specific situation. Valorization, the value assigned to something can vary depending on the context. For example, a historical artifact versus a used car. And indexicality, by definition, indexical terms rely heavily on context for their meaning. So there is degree of transformation. The extent to which these concepts involve transformation or context dependence can vary. Sublation involves a more complex and dialectical transformation. Valorization involves the degree of change. Value change can range from subtle to drastic. Indexicality, some terms are more rigidly indexical, that is pronouns, and you can see in reality how that is a problem. Our current issue about pronouns, the hegemony of pronouns, than others, that is words with multiple meanings. So let me close off my yakking today about the transformation problem, Marx's transformation problem. And let me just note here, this is the 20th century discussions of Karl Marx's economics. The transformation problem is the problem of finding a general rule by which to transform the values of commodities based on their socially necessary labor content. We've talked about this before. According to his labor theory of value, into the competitive prices of the marketplace. The underlying problem, which has to do partially with things that are there, prices are interesting, but assuming that they are a kind of rigid or fixed value is very, very problematic. You can get very confused for a variety of reasons. I mean, prices aren't always the same because of commodity. Because when the commodities are exchanged, you have currency exchanges too. So the money becomes not quite as rigid as one might say. And for all kinds of reasons. The official reason, of course, could be simply on currency exchange. But recall, of course, that at every step, you have little weird things occurring. People add fees, like when you're in the airport trying to exchange your money. The socialists would say, well, the cost of exchange should be free. Well, it isn't. Regardless of where you go, even if it's free for you at your bank, the bank gets its share somehow. And that is, if you do a currency exchange at a bank at which you have money. So, for example, if you go to Canada and you go to Toronto Dominion Bank, your account, I think they used to, your TD account in the U.S. could cover the fees for currency exchange that you would make when you go there. This problem was first introduced by Marxist economist Conrad Schmidt and later dealt with by Marx in Chapter 9 of the draft of Volume 3 of Capital. The essential difficulty was this: given that Marx derived profit in the form of surplus value from direct labor inputs, and that the ratio of direct labor input to capital input varied widely between commodities, how could he reconcile this with a tendency towards an average rate of profit on all capital invested among industries if such a tendency, as predicted by Marx and Ricardo, exists? So it's on the one hand, something that seems paradoxical, but actually seems fairly obvious. And it sort of suggests that, well, maybe we shouldn't be relying on averages and that's kind of the general answer you would have to Marx. So I include an article by various people, but Andrew Kleiman, and it's interesting only because I think it's Andrew Kleiman who sues a radical journal for defaming him or some other kind of Mickey Mouse thing. And why if your reputation is so important, why would you besmirch it by suing other radicals? I mean, it's just I never understand these matters, but no, I do understand them. It was simply you know, if you have tenure at a certain time, you begin to think that you're like the total center of knowledge and of your own particular thing, and you shouldn't be insulted. um, there's certain egoism at work, and some people get crazy about it. Needless to say, Kleiman is kind of there in the midst of what is called a value crisis, or a controversy, a value controversy, and it goes on for a decade at least. And Kleiman makes himself sort of a pariah, even though some of his ideas are actually quite good. But needless to say, other people don't want to, engage him because, I might say something wrong and blah, 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 blah. It's very Trump-like in that sense. I'm not saying that Kleiman's like Trump. I'm just saying that, stuff happens. So it's the publication of the third volume of Capital, and this is an article by a fellow by the name of Chinara, who is trying to make this a lot easier and less antagonistic. Since the publication of the third volume of Capital in 1894, Karl Marx's analysis has suffered at the hands of not simply those who openly oppose Marxism, but also those who claim to stand in his tradition. Two key planks of Marx's work have been challenged. The first is the law of the tendency of profit to fall. This is a big deal. This is always quoted, and it has lots of implications. It has an implication that, well, capitalism is going to fail eventually. So, this tendency of the profit to fall is sort of a sign of that. The second is Marx's solution to what has become known as the transformation problem. There's a ton of literature on this. The shift from the analysis of values in the first volume of Capital to the analysis of prices in the third. And yes, there are answers to this, and it depends on how literal or figurative you want to get. And it gets either people in trouble, or it's a way of picking an argument. It creates logical fallacies. It's stupid, at least in my mind, because we know that values are not always identical to prices. And yet, because in your reasoning, if you make certain commitments to the equivalence, you can see where this is going to become a real problem. Andrew Kleiman's book answers Marx's critics new and old. Setting aside the question of whether Marx's ideas are right or wrong, Kleiman argues that Capital can and should be interpreted in such a way as to render it internally consistent. Now, the idea of internal consistency is in many other fields, and from arts through science as functional relations. So a kind of formalism or functionalism is at work here. How much it is or isn't is problematic, but every field has this kind of, I would assert, has a kind of formal or functionalist problem that you need to sort of work through. And it doesn't depend on your field. There's some very clear problems that are asked when you try to say, well, it's got to be internally consistent before you can make judgment, blah, blah, blah. Only by following this method can a sensible interpretation be constructed and tested against reality. Kleiman's book sets out one such interpretation of Capital, which satisfies this criterion. All this is done with admirable clarity, in stark contrast to most of the literature on value theory, quote unquote. Kleiman responds to the attacks on Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall in a chapter that parallels the article by Chris Harman in this issue of International Socialism. But it is the second challenge to Marx, the so-called transformation problem, that forms the most interesting section of this book. The problem has often been posed using complicated mathematical formulations, making it seem like the preserve of capital geeks, but the basic issues are relatively easy to grasp. For Marx, the value of a commodity, same thing, the commodities, big C, reflects the amount of living labor expended by workers in its creation, plus the amount of dead labor, that is past labor, crystallized in the instruments of production, raw materials, etc., used up in its production. That's overgeneralizing, and that can be problematic, and it's still that kind of congealed sort of deal. The value can be measured as a sum of money reflecting the socially necessary labor time required to produce the commodity. Here, socially necessary refers to the labor time required under normal conditions with the average prevalent skill and intensity. The capitalist has to purchase the dead labor, darn machinery, and makes no profit from this. The living labor, on the other hand, has a double value. The capitalist receives a day's labor, but only has to pay enough in the form of a day's wages for the reproduction of the labor power. Because the wage merely reflects the amount of value needed to get the worker back to work and raise the next generation of workers, that's sustenance and reproduction, it will tend to be less than the new value the worker creates. The remaining hours create surplus value for the capitalist, and this is the basis of profit. The rate of profit is the ratio of surplus value to the total capital advanced in wages and inputs of dead labor, which all seems pretty good in algebra. Marx provides this basic account in the first volume of Capital. Here he is considering capital in general. He abstracts from the effect of competition between different capitals or the coexistence of different sectors of the economy. This allows him to locate the origin of surplus value in the exploitation at the heart of the capitalist production process. In the third volume of Capital, he goes beyond the concept of capital in general and considers capitalism as a concrete system where there are many capitals. To do this, he must integrate the sphere of production with the sphere of exchange. So hence the whole thing we started out with. You got to kind of look at this in a broader systemic sort of context. On the basis of the analysis of value in the first volume of Capital, each industry would have a different rate of profit because each uses a different ratio of living and dead labor, different machinery, different organic compositions of capital, as Marx puts it. And it could boil down to the efficiency of different brands of machinery you pick or different qualities of raw material. But in capitalism, as it actually exists, profit rates tend to equalize across economies. Marx argues that the capital flows between sectors, from those with low rates of profit to those with high ones, as capitalists seek to maximize their profitability. Those goods in sectors with a high rate of profit will be produced in greater quantities, lowering their prices, while those in sectors with a low rate of profit will become scarce and their prices will rise. Over time, these changes in price will tend to equalize profit rates between sectors. This process is the transformation of values into what Marx called prices of production. According to this analysis, prices of production are a more complicated expression of value. The surplus value created across the whole economy is reallocated to different capitalists in such a way as to form a general rate of profit. Marx showed that from the point of view of the capitalists, this process seems to happen the other way around. That is, in calculating the price of their goods, capitalists look at their input costs, that is the cost of production, locally, and then mark up the price according to the general rate of profit multiplied by the capital invested. It appears as if the capitalist simply receives from society a share of total profit reflecting their investment. Needless to say, there's lots of oversimplification here. Because prices of production are in Marx's analysis simply a complex form assumed by value, a number of aggregate equalities must hold. The total price of the outputs of an economy must equal the total value of the outputs, and total profit must equal the total surplus value produced. So just to stop for a second, the problem for Marx is simply a problem. Well, it's not simply, but it is a problem of aggregation and a problem of large numbers. Marx's account has proved remarkably controversial, remarkably. In particular, papers by Ladislav Borkowitz from 1906 to 1907 and similar accounts that have followed sought to prove that Marx's account produces a difference between input and output prices, and this difference leads to internal contradiction, specifically to a spurious disruption of the production process as inputs and outputs fail to match up. This is the clearing problem. Having taken this step, Borkowitz corrected Marx's account with a solution that severed values and prices into two discordant systems. Now, what Kleiman does is he shows that there are two fundamental problems with approaches such as Borkowitz's. So he's going all the way back to 1906 to try and see if we can fix this. First, like most interpretations of capital, Borkowitz's is what Kleiman calls a dual system interpretation. In chapter 9 of the third volume of Capital, Marx gives numeric examples to illustrate his transformation. But in these examples, he does not appear to apply this transformation to the cost of the inputs into production that the capitalist purchases. In the same chapter, Marx comments, we had originally assumed that the cost price of a commodity equaled the value of the commodities consumed in its production. But for the buyer, the price of production of a specific commodity is its cost price, and thus may pass as cost price into the prices of commodity. This is that whole question of where you're transferring the costs of things, which occurs constantly under capitalism. You're passing through the cost of something via the price, etc. Since the price of production may differ from the value of a commodity, it follows that the cost price of a commodity containing this price of production of another commodity may also stand above or below that portion of its total value derived from the value of the means of production consumed by it. Dual system interpreters conclude from this passage that the values of inputs must be also transformed into prices to complete the transformation process, leading to two separate systems. One influential version of this is the new interpretation, which emerged in the 1980s. Now, this is after a whole bunch of arguments and fights and a variety of forums, and aside from the transformations of the world economy and political events and all kinds of crap. This account attempts to reconnect the value and price systems through wages, which are held to be equal in the two systems. Both the traditional dual system accounts and the new interpretation are flawed, according to Kleiman, because cost prices and capital advances differ across value and price systems. There are consequently two distinct and unequal general rates of profit as well, and the remaining aggregate equalities cannot hold true, contrary to what Marx concluded. Now, this particular fight here, attempts to claim, with a variety of reasons for doing it, that this collapses the entire Marxist model. That doesn't. I mean, if you look at a sophisticated input-output system, you could actually do this. And this is why I keep mentioning, well, we have computers that can handle all this now. We didn't have them. They were very difficult in, a pre-computer age. And now that we have networking that allows for the transformation of databases and information nearly instantaneously, I think we can fix some of these problems. Kleiman argues for a single system interpretation. Such interpretations also emerged in the 1980s. They offer an alternative solution to the problems posed by Marx's shift from value to price in capital. The inputs into production, that is wages, raw materials, machinery, and so on, are always values rather than prices. But they're not the values required to produce these things. They are the values that the capitalist must advance to purchase them. And to acquire the needed means of production, the firm needs to buy them at their actual price, not at their value. You can see how complicated this can get. And particularly when you have different accounting systems, and then when you offshore production, it gets even worse, because then you've got to translate money and currency and blah blah blah. It gets really, and then you've got capital and debt in the same, and all that other stuff. Kleiman provides textual evidence to show that this is a possible interpretation of market. However, the Kleiman's case, this interpretation allows a consistent account of capital. Now, there's a second problem with Borkowitz and most of those who have followed him. Borkowitz assumes that the values of commodities, when they are treated as inputs into a cycle of production, are the same as their values when they leave the same cycle as outputs. Kleiman refers to this as a simultaneous valuation, and he rejects it in favor of temporal valuation. Kleiman's point is simple. You can't produce anything used inputs that have not yet been produced. Well, that's at one level. The value that must be advanced to obtain the inputs in a given period depends on the output price in the previous period. So there is a temporal reason that it establishes a kind of, as it were, index for how you should proceed. Kleiman gives a number of powerful examples to justify this claim. One of the most straightforward is to consider the entire economy as being based on the production of corn. Now, this can get really tedious here, and there's a whole literature on corn models versus iron models, so don't get too crazy. Which is itself grown from corn seed. Corn is both the input and output. And there's a difference, of course, between seed corn and cob corn because of whatever. There's lots of things going on. Kleiman shows through a simple calculation that if a drought means that 10 bushels of corn were planted, but only 9 were harvested, the living labor put in by the farmers must, by the same simultaneous interpretation, be negative. That is equal to minus 1 bushel worth of labor. Ridiculous results such as this are avoided if it is assumed that prices of outputs and inputs do not have to match in a given cycle. In the example cited, the price of corn rises after the drought. Kleiman also shows that the simultaneous valuation leads directly to what he calls physicalism. If inputs and outputs have the same value for a given commodity, then whatever the intention of the author, and many claim to reject a physicalism, the physical quantities of outputs rather than the labor embodied within the outputs are all that matters. This is a kind of reductionism. Kleiman's shift to temporal valuation immediately undermines Borkowitz's argument. Borkowitz bases his critique on a simple reproduction model in which the same physical qualities of goods are produced in each cycle of production. See, it's still all about the assumptions. Here, the input and output values can be made to match up. So, for example, there's always sufficient demand for wage goods to match the output of the sector producing wage goods. Once values are transformed to prices, supply and demand can no longer match and reproduction can't continue. But Kleiman can construct a second cycle such that the supply in the first cycle matches demand in the second cycle. Once this is combined with the idea that prices of production of outputs are the values advanced in purchase inputs, that is the single system approach, it can be shown that Marx's aggregate equalities still hold. Prices seem to be complex expressions of value, and total profit equals total surplus value. The dual system interpretation that Kleiman surveys do not maintain these qualities. Kleiman's solution will look counterintuitive to anyone else more familiar with dual system interpretations. The total value of inputs and outputs changes between cycles, and not simply a question of quantities of money. The amounts equally represent labor time, even though the physical output and production methods are identical in each cycle. But counterintuitive solutions are not always wrong, and Kleiman's case is powerfully stated. This book, that is Kleiman's book, is the clearest exposition of what has become known as the temporal single system interpretation, the TSSI, an approach shared with authors such as Guillermo Carcetti, the late Guillermo Carcetti, and Alan Freeman. Freeman and Kleiman are seen kind of as a duo act, and so you'll see Kleiman mentioned in the same context as Freeman, and Carcetti is sort of there but not there, and part of it happens to be just simply he's in Italy and he's got a whole bunch of other kind of production issues and other issues that are going on. Unfortunately, the most convincing recent rival interpretation provided by Alfredo Saad-Filho in his book The Value of Marx is dismissed by Kleiman in a single footnote. Saad-Filho's account builds on Ben Fine and Lawrence Harris's 1979 work, Rereading Capital, and John Weeks's 1981 work, Capital and Exploitation. This body of work does seem to lead to two separate systems. As Fine and Saad-Filho write in their most accessible account of Marx's theory, Marx's Capital, commodities have values as well as prices. Two distinct accounting systems, not necessarily equally significant either in theory or practice, are possible. However, whatever one thinks of this, their work presents persuasive evidence that Marx's transformation is not primarily a theory of prices, and the various attempts to solve the transformation problem are therefore missing the point. Yes, indeed. This body of work has also sought to capture some of the temporal nature of capitalist accumulation by highlighting the distinction drawn by Marx between the organic and the value compositions of capital. Both are value measures of the technical composition of capital, that is, the physical ratio of dead labor to living labor. And technical composition means, of course, machines as well, right? The organic composition abstracts from the sphere of exchange, ignoring the continual changes to the value of inputs due to technical change in other sectors. The value composition integrates the two spheres of exchange and production and takes into account these changes. That's what the cycle and circuits we're looking at above are. They're not identical to the ones that Kleiman, actually Kleiman and Freeman sort of don't like diagrams either, but that's another story. Sadfilo claims that Marx sets out in his transformation using the organic composition of capital, not the value composition, proving that Marx is not concerned with developing a price theory at this point. The role of Marx's transformation is merely to show how prices are formed in the sphere of production as surplus is reallocated. So it's a kind of planning deal. Only then is a second stage possible in which Sadfilo argues the value composition must be used and inputs transformed to prices. A more direct engagement with this account would both challenge this body of work and strengthens Kleiman's analysis. So, finally, no attention is given to the possibility of developing temporal dual system interpretations. There is an important but little-known article first published in English in International Socialism in 1979 by Miguel transformation problem. Writes, since von Borkowitz, it has frequently been assumed that Marx's solution to the transformation problem is faulty. In this article, we shall try to prove A, that Marx's solution was correct, and B, that it leads to no inconsistencies in his theory of value. The system Garcia presents is similar to that of Kleiman. It preserves the aggregate equalities of Marx, and it explicitly rejects the use of simultaneous equations. This is an important deal here. Garcia writes that even if the inputs needed to be transformed, this transformation could not be the same as those involving the commodities that they create. When they were acquired, these products did not yet exist. This is an important issue. It's a transformational issue. To determine cost prices of commodities by their sales prices is a solution which recalls that of Baron Munchausen, who descended from the moon several times, tying one end of a rope to another, and in order to do this, he had to untie them first of all. And with respect, this is an example of a kind of Borromean knot, which gets us back to the other analysis there, and a bunch of other things about Munchausen. But anyway, however, Garcia's critique differs from Kleiman's in two respects. The first one, it is a system of prices, not values, although prices remain linked to values, whatever that means. And second, Garcia maintains that simple reproduction makes no sense in this context. And it can be shown that Garcia's solution does not work in simple reproduction models. So once the analysis shifts to many capitals, which is the point of volume 3 by Marx, and away from capital in general, see, many capitals is not the same thing as capital in general. It's just a generalization problem, which Garcia wrongly associates with pre-capitalist commodity production, which is problematic in itself. He argues that equalization of the rate of profit is a consequence of the way in which commodities appear, not now as simple values, but as means for the realization of the capitals that produce them. This implies expanded accumulation and not simple accumulation. So there's a difference at scale, which is why I keep talking about, well, this sort of looks okay, sort of at in terms of individuals, but when you scale it up, it changes. So if Garcia is right, there may be space to develop a temporal dual system interpretation of capital. Kleiman himself seems less indecisive in dismissing this possibility, Direct textual evidence suggests that Marx was a single system theorist. He had to be sure. A good deal of evidence clearly favors this interpretation. Evidence adduced on behalf of the dual system interpretation is equally compatible with a single system interpretation, which renders logical consistency a little bit screwed up, as I hope you can see. Nonetheless, the interpretation developed by Kleiman and others must certainly have a strong case to be considered the most compelling and consistent interpretation of capital. This book deserves to be read and debated by all those interested in coming to grips with Marxist theory. So, it's a tempest in a teapot on the one hand, up to the point of, people suing each other. It's an important question and problem. And so when you go to look for the temporal single system interpretation, so assume that there's the possibility of a temporal dual system interpretation, a TDSI, as opposed, and there are articles on this, TSSI. Let's look first at the definition, or at least the rendered definition in Wikipedia on this. So what would Marx do? Karl Marx's value theory emerged in the 1980s, the TSSI, in response to renewed allegations that his theory was riven with internal inconsistencies and that it must therefore be rejected or corrected. The inconsistency allegations have been a prominent feature of Marxian economics and the debate surrounding it since the 1970s. Kleiman argues that charges of inconsistency serve to legitimate the suppression of Marx's critique of political economy and current day research based upon it, as well as the correction of Marx's inconsistencies. Proponents of the temporal single system interpretation, the TSSI, of Marx's value theory claim that the supposed inconsistencies are actually the result of misinterpretation. As described above, they argue that Marx's theory is understood as temporal and single system. The internal inconsistencies disappear if you do that. In a recent survey of the debate, a proponent of the TSSI concludes that the proofs of inconsistency are no longer defended. The entire case of Marx has been reduced to the interpretive issue. And you'll find that if you're a humanist, reducing anything to the interpretive issue does not solve anything. Critics of TSSI, including David Feldman, see criticism section below, argue that, now I'll just front end this by saying that Feldman is a little bit more of a orthodox kind of guy. I wouldn't say that he's a tanky, but he has a certain agenda. Argue that Marx intended to present what they characterize as a structurally consistent model of value formation in a capitalist economy with a competitive profit rate equalization. They claim that Marxist formalizations fail to do this, but also that they characterize this as fundamental insights can be revealed and extended by means of models and concepts that emerged after his time. Instead of trying to defend the consistency of Marx's original statements, non-TSSI Marxist theorists pursue what they characterize as an ever more effective versions of what they would claim to be the core theory. So in other words, the core theory keeps getting revised, that's all. They also claim that they believe that Marx himself would have done this. This is this whole business of counterfactuals, And David Feldman claimed that if a viable technical change is made and the real wage rate is constant, the new material rate of profit must be higher than the old one. That's all that Ocasio or Romer, or Foley, or I, or anyone else has ever claimed. And, if that is a viable claim, then, probably sure. There's other implications, though, of course. Duncan Foley, who lives in the same town as David Feldman, and, so hence there's all kinds of weird interchanges that occur that are simply inside the inside the island of Manhattan. I understand Freeman and Kleiman to be arguing that Ocasio's theorem, as literally stated, is wrong because it is possible for the money and labor rates of profit to fall under the circumstances specified in its hypothesis. I accept their examples as establishing this possibility. Kleiman has recently discussed what he called the disintegration of the Marxian school of economics. So there's a whole implication of this, that one way of doing this is to say that Marx's voice is not involved here. It's just, defending Marx is kind of like defending the Bible or something. In this paper, he proposes measures to halt and reverse this process. Mainly, number one, the field needs to greatly reduce its dependence on the resources of academia. Intellectual autonomous zones need to be creative. I don't know what that means, but you can imagine what they might mean. Cooperative behavior and attitudes, not uncooperative. We all need to be nice to each other, need to be fostered and rewarded. Yeah, like not suing people. Efforts to solve theoretical problems, not efforts to create and perpetuate them, should be fostered and rewarded. Run-of-the-mill anomalies, such as the transformation problem, should not be allowed to become sources of internal crisis, and people outside the field need to appreciate how profoundly the myth of Marx's internal consistencies has damaged it. Since a false charge of inconsistency issued knowingly is the moral equivalent of defamation, it would not be unreasonable for the public to ask those who have perpetuated the myth of inconsistency to make restitution. So on the one hand, he says we should all get along. On the other hand, you shouldn't insult me. So whatever. That's kind of where we are. Now that's by way of my yakking for nearly an hour and a half on this silliness here. But I hope that this helps. And if you read through it, you'll understand that there are these textual interpretation problems that are probably no different. They're not identical to, obviously, but no different than the same kinds of doctrinal, dogmatic perhaps, or dogmatism differences that the Catholic religion has with Protestantism, of course, involving other different matters. But you can see that some of these arguments can become pretty ugly, and the math isn't going to always solve it. It really still comes down to empirical study of exact things. I think there's a new Kleiman book on the recent recession, and I think he's trying to apply his system of beliefs to that, and I'm not sure whether it works or not. And it's more reading to do, of course, but the Great Recession, of course, is a interesting place for argument since it has slightly different variables, is still not one that addresses kind of actual working class issues, even though obviously the working class was clearly affected by the Great Recession. But I think these are worth conversing upon, and of course not getting diverted by this little sort of episode in the Kleiman, whatever. Kleiman should be retiring soon, so somebody may pick up the thing, but it may fade away, just like Borkowitz's ideas did. These ideas always change, and we're building on them. The big question is how much are we willing to sort of see these a kind of, and to use a big word, incommensurable issues exist in the movement towards a better theory that provides, equanimity, judicial solutions that eliminates equality, that redistributes capital, etc. Okay, I'm finished talking. Perhaps you have questions or comments.
Are the sectors the same as the departments that arise from the difference in the variability of the duration of the I can't remember the name of the cycle, but there was this cycle that
Yes, to make it simple.
Okay, yeah, I thought. Thanks. Yeah.
The idea here is in emphasizing what Marx is talking about. I mean, it's just what he's talking about. Circuits, and all circuits are not equal. They can be different. They can have different rates. They can have different speeds. The problem for Marx is that at one level, he wanted to generalize from it and say, you can sort of prove that the capitalists are ripping us off and sort of go from there. That's what I've said all along, is that, it supports, the manifesto in effect at one level, but at another level, it requires us to think much more, quantitatively. But the qualitative result is not that different. I mean, we know rich people are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. I think that's
Right.
pretty fucking apparent. Anyway,
Thanks. Yeah.
does that make sense? Has what I've been yammering about here made sense? I know it's a little, it's right. It's all about inside baseball, but it is kind of, it's no different than people who have put sabermetric analytic guys, quants or quints, whatever, on their staffs, and whether you actually win games or not. That
Well,
makes
yeah,
sense to
I
people?
felt myself, I think so. Yeah. There was one point there where I felt myself kind of, wanting to pick a side or something, feeling that tug, but
I
resisted
think
it,
that the safest thing is to pick all sides, is to say, it's let 100 flowers bloom. No, seriously, it is about 100 flowers kind of theory. And if it just seems bizarre to, well, there's just a school of us who would believe that we all, in our ideal form of the ivory tower, should all be nice to each other. And once I have this theory: if you have to sue for tenure, I don't think you want to belong there. That's all.
Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's just when it comes down to needing lawyers, it just lawyers represent a certain type of power. But if you need to leverage what is supposed to be a sort of more genteel and equanimical kind of community, then you've probably become a pariah, and it's time for exit of some kind. You don't think this happens, right? Ever? There are some really famous accounts of suing your institution for tenure. And it doesn't get better with the quality of the institution. It probably gets worse, actually, because there's some really big tenure cases against Harvard, for example, that were just dumb.
Yeah.
There's some that are just perfectly okay. I mean, Cornell West probably, well, the original reality was that most of us thought he had tenure at Princeton, and that all he had to do was sort of transfer the tenure over to someplace else, but apparently not.
Non-transferable. Well, yeah, I was listening to Richard Wolff interview, and he was talking about how he, arrived at Harvard, and some of his, questions were uncomfortable, I guess, to professors, I guess, based on, their tenure status in some cases.
Yep. Well, I've said this before, but there's a remarkably great article written in Business Week about the purge of Marxists from Harvard. It happened just as the moment, and there's several articles on this, when all these guys, Bowles and Gintis and Wolf and a bunch of other folks, not Resnick, but whatever. Anyway, all wind up at Amherst, at UMass Amherst.
Yeah.
Oh, unless you think that doesn't happen in other fields. This happens a lot of places.
Right. Yeah. It's probably happens across the board wherever there's
In every field,
yeah.
there's like it's like street gangs. So there's a string theory gang somewhere, right? Quantum theory, street gang.
There was a bit earlier on about industrial production, and that made me think right away of the American effort when they were making the atomic bomb, and they were able to marshal this incredible resource like the Tennessee River Valley, where they
Yes.
were doing the separation or whatever to get the stuff for the atomic bombs. But that's not, I mean, I guess that was funded by the government, right? I mean, it's not like,
Well, everything was. Yes, absolutely. There's no
so it's like they
corporation.
had unlimited capital there, right? Or something.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, No, the whole idea is that it's a public deal. This is the extension of the New Deal.
Oh, okay, right. Wow, yeah, I didn't even think of it that way.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else? See what else. Well, let's hope that there's the offers come up for Prof. John.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, good news.
Excellent. You're quite right. It's no different in other fields, right? There are other fields where the same shit happens. There have been cases, of course, where Marxists were, suing to get tenure, whatever. But there equally so, there are feminists who sued in order to get tenure. Some of those people are still alive, and their stories should be told. And I mean, other people of the same generations have gotten tenure without much of a problem. And some of it just simply happens that you've got a better street gang ensconced in a particular department, and they're hiring you because they want you to be there. And how are they going to do this? Well, they're going to manipulate the surplus value of the institution, especially if it's a private one, to give you a six-figure salary, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, wow.
My uncle sued for reverse discrimination for tenure.
Okay, that's certainly possible.
Yeah, he taught at Alabama State, the HBCU down in Montgomery, and
Really?
they were giving tenure to African American professors over white professors. So
Yeah, that
they
is
he won. So yeah,
this happens,
it
but
does.
it has a much more insidious, uh, you know, it goes back to separate but equal stuff in the South. No, there's like all these stories about, well, how much money are you supposed to be? You weren't giving the same amount of money to, and it only has to do with public HBCUs, but it's really quite interesting. I find it more amusing that when an HBCU in their football teams can only field a white quarterback. There have been those instances, which I always find interesting. You'll have probably a 80% black team, but you have a white quarterback. This may not matter to you, but there are several instances where this does and has happened, and it happens for good reasons. I mean, it's just meritocracy. The guy is much better.
Warren, why did your uncle sue?
They were promoting giving tenure to black professors over over the white professors that were more qualified. So this was back in the I think the late 70s. Apparently, there was a famous judge decided it down in Montgomery.
Montgomery, Alabama?
Alabama, yeah.
Well, they're known for their fairness there.
Yes.
This shit goes back to Plessy Ferguson, the system of state supported HBCUs in the South is incredibly weird and problematic, and uh, worth examining yet again and again. It's having worked at an HBCU, I can tell you that it is incredibly problematic. But in the converse case or the obverse case, it is it's an important issue that if you have a state institution that there are no blacks only institutions. There should be no blacks only institutions in public education. Period. Just period. It just shouldn't be.
Yeah, well, there shouldn't be any educational institution that is one so-called race, exclusively, right?
Yeah. Well, and similarly from a gender point of view, there are
Yeah.
only a couple of there are only a couple of women's colleges that are publicly supported in in state systems. I think they're moving towards removing one in Mississippi. There's a Mississippi College of Women or women's university or whatever that has that same issue.
Folks, I hate asking for money. It's my least favorite part of running for office. I know.
Was that Joe?
Good evening. Yes, hello. That was my telephone. It's a YouTube ad. It is a minute after 7, so it's writing time.
It's writing time. Thank you very much for your attention and indulgence. I actually got to the end of it today, so I guess I'm gonna have to write something else. Come back and visit us at This and That, 5 p.m. every day. Be there, be square. Joe, you can shut it off now.
Is the recording over now?
No, it's still open. Joe has to shut down the live stream, unless you like being on the live stream.
No, I don't want to be anywhere. So now it's over, right?
Don't know.
How do we tell? How can you tell?
It has a little thing that says live YouTube, and I still can see it.
I see a little capsule shaped thing that says live. So it's probably he didn't do it. Joe, are you there, Joe? Okay, well. And Lee left. Anyway, I think that's the little thing. Oh, it's still there. Hello, Joe. Can you end the live stream?
Well, while we're waiting for that, how are you, Nancy? You haven't been around too much.
Well, that's true. I was here yesterday. We're there. We're whatever. However you would
Right.
say that.
Everything.
Well, I went away.
Oh, you went away.
Yeah. The only one that asked me if I had a nice time was Sharon. Anyway,
Where did you go?
I went up to